Throw a PowerPoint presentation up there. There we go. All right. So I want to preface this by saying that in general, there is no positive side of stress. Stress is usually not a good thing. This last 18 months are kind of an attest to that, that when we are in stressful situations, they're typically associated in psychology with negative results. And so we don't really have many instances in which we look at stress as a positive motivating factor. However, along with some colleagues of mine, we've been looking at what motivates people to join or take part in fan activities. And one of those motivating factors that has been pretty well established in the literature is what we call eustress, positive stress. And it's a great segue in talking about the stuff that's going on between tailgating and anticipation of a football game and what happens during that homecoming game, or if you're engaging in some activity that kind of adds a little anxiety, but that anxiety is there for sort of a payoff. And so that's what I'm going to kind of get into with this talk today. So I guess I'll start with that question. When is stress not stressful? Very rarely. And again, even with this example, with the discussion of eustress or positive stress, stress is still stressful. It still causes this kind of physiological reaction where we experience this heightened state of anxiety. We might feel nervous. We might feel kind of unsettled. But the main difference between kind of stress and eustress comes into sort of what we're doing when we're engaged in these behaviors and what the payoff ultimately is. So most stress, as I've said before, is undesirable. It's defined more broadly as discomfort or an undesirable state. It's grounded in concern about how a situation will resolve and with our ability to cope with that outcome. And so we stress over things if we feel we're not in control. We stress over uncertainty. There's a huge aspect of stress in some of the social psych that I do research on. But ultimately, it's this undesirable state. We don't want it. We don't want to feel it. We don't want to engage in it. There are plenty of things that universities, companies, individuals, self-help motivators, they're all interested in trying to help us reduce stress. And so we want to get rid of it. However, while saying it's not controversial to say that most of us want to avoid stress and in some situations, there are examples of individuals who might be motivated to join groups or might be motivated to participate in certain fan activities that would create stress in some way. And that's where we see eustress. So it was first defined by Wan, Schrader, and Wilson, at least in terms of the fan literature. It goes back beyond that to what's called euphoric stress. Double check that in my notes. Yeah, euphoric stress. Again, this positive association with it, but it's a positive form that stimulates and energizes the individual. And I'll kind of talk about ways in which this shows up. So typically, when we're thinking about this, and Daniel Wan's research predominantly looks at sport, this is sort of that there's 2 outs and it's the bottom of the 9th and your team is, behind by 1 run. It's sudden death overtime. It's we've got a 1 field goal to win. They just broke a record for a 66-yard field goal in a recent football game. And so that, if you're fans on that team, you're on the edge of your seat. It's the last seconds on the clock. It's the basketball shot from half court. It's whatever sport analogy we want to use for this. But if you're not a sport fan, it's getting to the end of that chapter and there's a cliffhanger. It's that, finishing book 1 of a trilogy and book 2's not going to come out for 3 months. 6 months, if you're a Game of Thrones fan, years. You're waiting for that next event, and that causes uncertainty, anxiety, or stress. So this really gets its start with Daniel Wan and his sport motivation scale. He noted a number of things that caused people to become sport fans. And so there were things that included things like escapism, entertainment, aesthetics. So, having a specific play or some novel experience. And then, of course, Eustress. And he was one of the first, really not the first to study the concept of Eustress, but the first to kind of conceptualize it within the fan research in this scale. And he defined it as excitement and anxiety that often accompanies sports spectating. And this goes back beyond. Smith looked at the search for excitement, so kind of novelty and excitement that might drive us or motivate us to participate in certain activities or go to sporting events as a means for escape. And so it's heavily tied to this need to kind of escape maybe the stress in our lives and move to that kind of edge of your seat excitement kind of stress into a football game, which in this case the real stress is on the players. You're just spectating, but there is that level of excitement, there is that level of uncertainty that comes out of it. FAM directly ties it to fan experience of pleasure, to stress in sports, that we're actually looking for this. We actually gain some sort of pleasure out of this, as opposed to, again, typically avoiding stressful events. And it brings us into kind of a modern day approach that colleagues that I work with, Dr. Courtney Plant, Dr. Stephen Ryson, and currently joining this group is our new faculty member, Dr. Thomas Brooks, who are examining what motivates people. And we're working on the development of the CAPE scale, a measurement for fan motivation. And one of these motivating factors, of course, is Eustress. And so again, whether or not you're sitting at the edge of your seat for the big climactic event in a movie, or you're watching your favorite team try to make it to the Super Bowl, or our Highlands football team trying to win this homecoming game. And so if we take this beyond sport, we can actually go even further back to its origins, going as far back as philosophers such as Aristotle, who argued that people seek out stress via their consumption of drama and tragedy, that watching these sort of intense emotional plays would give them some benefit. We enjoy this, and maybe it is because we're not the ones engaging in this particular behavior. But there is this note that goes back as far as we've been kind of conceptualizing why do people engage in stress in some way through the consumption of media. And Aristotle notes that part of this is that they find cathartic release in the process. And that's similar to what we're finding in modern research, is that it does seem to be tied to escapism, to getting away, to catharsis is emotional release. And so where stress would normally just sort of sit with us, this second aspect, that because there's typically a payoff, because there's the end of the book or the end of the movie where the heroes win or someone's triumphant, or there is at least a conclusion, there's that lack of uncertainty, that release of uncertainty, and that can help the individual. And of course, this is seen in modern media and sport fans. And there's a lot that's really interesting in how it splits. If we go beyond Wan, it's been associated with the level of kind of aggression and violence in the sport. And so we typically see Eustress as less of a motivating factor for something like tennis, because there's not as much, there might be, but also the norms of the game are not as, you're discouraged from cheering. You're discouraged from getting overly excited at a tennis match or a golf match. While you might experience some Eustress, there are other factors that are going to typically get people interested in those particular sports. Um, Higher Eustress scores are also associated with greater team and sport fan identification, as well as a greater likelihood of being personally involved in sports. It's more associated with desire to escape from everyday routine. And it's also associated, which is kind of an interesting factor, with well-being. So fans who gain more well-being and sort of positive emotional and physical outcomes from their sport interest typically report eustress as being a stronger motivating factor. And this also bleeds into individuals who report greater levels of meaning in life and sense of life satisfaction in relation to their fan communities. So as I mentioned, Juan and others have tied eustress in sports fans to a number of things, like I said, well-being. In addition to this, as well as joy, so how much you actually enjoy the game, the joy and benefit you get, and to use the German phrase Schadenfreude, at the loss of an opposing team. And so you taking pleasure in someone else's pain or defeat. And so if you're already on the edge of your seat in regards to you're wanting your team to win, when the other team loses and your team prevails, it's even greater in terms of this. And so again, that stress builds up and it's released when that uncertainty goes away. And as I mentioned, there's this difference in the earlier literature where they use the term euphoric stress, and euphoric stress focused more on gaining excitement versus just a pure kind of emotion or negative emotional aspect. And so gaining excitement or emotional stimulation is what we tend to see as part of this, at least within the sport motivation literature. Gans and Juan both note those differences in sport types, the differences between fans at a football game or a boxing game versus a tennis match, or I've even found some interesting research regarding fans of opera and how they engage, to where even the events and the stories that are unfolding are very interesting, but there's less of that need for like excitement, because you don't want to be that one person in an opera who's like getting up and cheering. That's discouraged, just like it would be discouraged at a golf match or a golf game or a tennis match. Let's see. Yeah, and in addition to this, James and Ross, they wanted to look at differences in sports fans, and this is one of the exemplifiers of this, is that less aggressive or quiet sports, golf, tennis, tend to discourage noise, something that might make it very difficult for fans to kind of engage in at the same level as football fans or boxing fans, where you would see more eustress as a motivating factor. So this is kind of like not a one size fits all sort of motivator. So overall, what does eustress predict? So looking at this positive stress, those fans who are motivated by eustress, it predicts a greater likelihood to watch and attend sporting events, specifically those more kind of aggressive or sporting events that at least promote that outward release of emotion. So this could include baseball games, basketball games, obviously football games, but not as likely to, again, include things like golf and tennis. As I mentioned before, greater team and sport identification. So, again, if you're very into the game, if you are emotionally invested, you're probably going to identify, and this does apply to non-sport as well. And so we look at people who get motivated by certain television programs or movie franchises. If eustress is tied into it, is that edge of your seat excitement, we tend to see greater identity with those communities. And then also, as I mentioned before, higher likelihood to be involved in a sport. And this does seem overall to be tied to that need to escape. Escape is another very powerful motivator for sport, or not sport, but fan involvement in general. And people who have that sense, that need to escape, Eustress can be one of those things. If you're going to kind of feel that kind of stressful buildup, you want it to be revolving around something that you enjoy, or something that you're kind of emotionally connected to, rather than something that you're dreading, or something that you're generally stressing out about. That anxiety stress versus euphoric stress. As I mentioned, well-being, meaning in life, and life satisfaction as well. So again, I've kind of alluded to this. How does this play in non-sport fans? There are a number of research studies, but they're few and far between compared to sport. We obviously have non-sport groups like K-pop fans, and other concert-going fan communities. Szerzynska in 2018 looked at that being able to engage with their musical interest in concert attendance, which, I mean, we might see major differences in this if we're looking at this in like 2021, with like a lack for the last couple of years of in-person concerts. But there are a number of things, including self-esteem boosts and other well-being increases with attending a concert. So attending concerts boosts sensory stimulation, which they tie in this research to eustress. Much in the same way that someone attending a football game, it's boosting that sensory experience. It's also boosting your experience by being around so many people. We should see it as well. And they also extend this research to music programs and idol competitions. So for any fans of American Idol or The Masked Singer, whatever the newest version of that is, that edge of your seat excitement, that uncertainty of who the individual is or who the winner of the competition is going to be, is what draws people. And I think reality television in general draws people in a similar fashion, that there's this emotional sense, but there's at least an idea that there will be a payoff at the end. We also see this in fan-themed personality tests. Proudfoot et al. Examines this and how fans will take personality tests, or, probably the most common of these is sort of, if we think about this in modern fan culture, what Marvel character are you? What Harry Potter house would you be sorted in? The uncertainty that's tied to this is a way for those fans, having read the book series, already gone through the cliffhangers, awaiting those results boosts uncertainty, and then getting those results involves in kind of emotional release. And so we see what they tie that into the eustress literature as well. And we also see this with individuals who read mystery novels and other cliffhanger-esque books. So just to kind of wrap it all up, normally uncertainty is bad. We do not like stress. We don't like uncertainty. We don't like being anxious. However, if it's tied to our interests, if it's tied to something that we're interested in, that we identify with, it may boost excitement and also add to that payoff at the end. And this might be due, we're still kind of conceptualizing this beyond just people are interested in sport or interested in something because they like that excitement or that edge of your seat excitement. But it might be positive in this case because of that self-chosen nature. This is not a group that you kind of become a part of. You're choosing these interests. And then, of course, it's closely tied to escapism. And so if we are going to have stress in our lives, we're going to choose the stress that we enjoy, or stress tied to things that we enjoy, as opposed to all of the other stress that's going on. And then as well, that these tend to be novel things. These are not day-to-day things. This is watching the Avengers fight Thanos. This is getting to the end of a book and knowing that there's a next chapter, there's a next book to read. All right. Oh, stop screen share.
I'll mute myself here. So that's great. There's a lot of things to think about there, and
Yeah.
yeah. I'm also thinking about those people who seek out stress, sometimes in a what might be considered an unhealthy way. Yeah.
There are like thrill seekers, individuals who go, mountain climbing or rappelling or skydiving. And again, it may be the self-chosen nature of that. They're putting themselves, they're doing the training. They're fairly confident they're going to get to the end successfully. And so there's that thrill that comes with it, that we kind of put ourselves in these stressful situations. But they're also novel. They're not, this person's day-to-day life may not be skydiving. It's kind of that, if it becomes work, it might be different. You might dread doing it. But because it's leisure, and that leisure activity, what motivates people to do it. There are a number, I think we've got, in this new scale that's coming out, there's like 25, 30 different core motivating factors, because everyone's in something for a different reason. But we definitely find that one of these reasons is eustress, is wanting that kind of exhilarating excitement, whether it be from skydiving or maybe, the Little Tamer. I'm going to read an Agatha Christie book.
So if anyone has any questions, please chime in. Now's your opportunity to get, I won't go so far as to say advice, but
I can't give you too
comments,
much
additions, but yeah, please, if you do have a question, go ahead and unmute yourselves. And I'm looking at things in the chat too. Let's see.
I just had a question, or I don't know if this would count as eustress, but it's something that I thought of when you proposed this topic. And I tend to put myself into stressful situations, intentionally. And the one I'm thinking of is, when I decide I'm going to run a marathon, it takes several months of training and, a lot of hard work. And I'm kind of stressed out about it, but I also know that, I'm going to feel accomplished, or, that I have done something good. And then, to sort of get myself through the times where I think it's stressful, I kind of give myself a little carrot that I'm going to have on the other end of the stress, like a vacation, or my favorite meal, or, something that I would really look forward to do. So do you think would that be considered eustress?
I don't know. I mean, it might tie into more of that like euphoric story. Yeah, I don't know. It does seem that like there are these stressful aspects. I mean, I think of like writing and trying to publish anything is just ridiculously stressful, and it's not enjoyably stressful. Like the payoff's good, and you feel very relieved at the end, and there might be something there. But I don't know if I'm ever like willingly being like, yes, I will deal with the reviewers on this publication, because I do not enjoy that, even if the end result is a reward. And so there might be like a rewarding aspect, and maybe it ties in because that there's an end. That like there's not as much uncertainty with something like that, where you're training and there's a reward at the end, and you're fairly confident you're going to make it. So there's some normal stress involved in there. But maybe kind of like that end result, that release, that cathartic release of emotion might at least relate a little bit to the eustress, because I mean, we don't know. We're going to hope that Highlands wins, but we're going to be on the edge of our seats while they're playing. And if it's a close game, we might build that uncertainty up. But it's enjoyable. Like even if they don't win, like we can still enjoy the game for what it is, and we can enjoy that edge of the seat excitement, and that might be tied to those levels of eustress.
Yeah, I think maybe watching a scary movie is kind of like that too.
Very, very much so. Yeah, the horror literature gets a little closer to it than like anyone else. Yeah, scary movies, like what draws people to those kind of emotional experiences, where we would normally be like, why do you want to feel stress? And to kind of tie that into Laura's question, yeah, I mean, people can definitely become addicted. I mean, I don't want to use addicted in the same sense because that's it's kind of a controversial, like what can you and can you not be addicted to? But if it becomes maladaptive, someone could develop very poor kind of, I guess, stress strategies to where, like mentally, if they're not feeling stress, maybe they don't feel that they're doing enough or they're not involved, and that would be very maladaptive. Because there's not really enjoyment coming out of that. And it's kind of what are you keeping in those stress cycles about? And so the big difference when we look at the Eustress literature, or when we look at this as a fan motivator, it's very much enjoyment. You're doing something that you enjoy, that you gain some, ultimately, even if it's an end goal result, you gain some pleasure from. So that payoff at the end of a mystery novel, seeing how your team performs, you're gaining something out of that. You're part of that community, or you're sharing that experience with other people. Whereas is typically when we think of like traditional stress, it's very self focused. There's a lot of other stuff that goes into it, and it's typically negative. It's typically not bringing us to a good place or not ending in a good result. It usually just ends with more stress. Whereas in this case, it's kind of keeping people, I guess, emotionally connected. And it is tied to that escape, which would be kind of the opposite of someone becoming kind of, I guess, addicted or put in that cycle of stress where there's no end result, there's no cathartic release, there's no positive with it. But yeah, I could certainly see that. That might be my next study. People addicted to stress, or people who get caught up, because there's probably a whole nother level of social factors that play into not being able to get rid of that, not being able to like unwind.
May I say something to that, Dr. Chadborn?
Of course.
My family's Cajun and Creole, and it's like all my life, those people that I call them, it's like stress is part of the whole situation. No matter what, whether you're doing good or bad, there's stress there. And I'm wondering if it goes back, all the way back to when Louisiana first started and they got there and they were French and Spanish and free people of color. And it was a whole nother thing. But even now in the 21st century, it's still that way. And it just, and for, like you said, lack of a better word, addicted was the only word I could think of, because it's like, why are y'all stressing?
My mom's side goes back to the Acadians. I'm from Louisiana originally, so
And you know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, there's definitely a cultural component to like stress, and then it may be that we just kind of like, on one hand, we don't talk about stress a lot, and so it sits with us. So we kind of stigmatize being open about certain stressful things, and that maybe being stressed and like expressing that like is just a way that we cope with it. Like we talk about it a lot because we want to release that stress in some meaningful way, even if it's just sharing it with other people. There's a whole side of psychology research that's tied to what's called terror management theory, just how we deal with stress and terror. And one of the things that they find is just having good relationships, because we can kind of spread it out in meaningful relationships. We have other people to support us. But if that just becomes sort of the loop, it's not really as positive.
That's the way it is. It's like, okay, we're stressed. Now we're all going to party, go get some crawfish, we're just going to party. Everybody's going to dance, go get the violins, and then it starts over again. And it's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, and that could be tied to some. There's huge discussions right now. I mean, kind of away from the Eustress side, there's a lot of discussions in like graduate student Twitter and other kind of, it's called support groups, about how to kind of rethink and like how we're approaching some of the research that we're doing and the expectations that we have to ultimately leave us less stressed, less consistently stressed when we're leaving graduate school or when we're kind of moving into careers. Lots of talks about detaching on occasion to try to reduce those stressful experiences. And one of the ways that we see with the fan literature is that, to bring it back to Eustress, is that we do like those exhilarating moments, or at least some of us like those exhilarating moments, and we want to find them, but we want to find them in, I guess, more safe, controlled aspects, as opposed to where stress usually comes from: sudden stuff, unexpected stuff, deadlines, things like that.
Well, I have a quick question. So is there, are there different chemicals that are released with quote unquote happy stress versus a painful stress, or is it the same kind of reaction that's going on?
I don't have an answer to that question. Dr. Heflin might know, but she's not here. As the neuroscience expert. In social psychology, we have some research that looks at how we experience emotions and mood states. And one of the arguments that we have is that it's all about the situation that we're in. So there's a famous study that has people walk over a really long bridge, and when they get to the end of the bridge, they either approach them immediately, so they're already feeling heart racing, nervous, or they give them 5-10 minutes to calm down. And they find that the people in those kind of intense, stressful situations are more likely to interpret the graduate student, the person playing the graduate student asking them the question, as being more attracted to them. And it's because the same physiological experience that we have, heart racing, sweaty palms, nervousness, is the same for fear as it is for attraction, because we're in that kind of anxious state. It's why arguably horror movies make good dates, because if you're in that heightened state of physiological arousal, it doesn't matter if it's fear or attraction. And so like it's the situation, it's how we interpret it. So if we're with someone we like, we might associate it with attraction, but if there's a bear on the other side of the field from us, we're going to interpret it as fear. And so the same thing might be going on, is that the stress is the same, but it's the situation and how we're kind of interpreting it. So if we're interpreting this as part of our kind of community, we're still experiencing that release of what is typically like cortisol, epinephrine, adrenaline. But we're, maybe there's a quicker payoff, maybe like we're interpreting it and processing it differently. I'd have to see if there's a study out there that's actually measuring like brain chemical release with like at a football game versus something else.
Oh.